What's up and welcome to my final summary review of the Flow Z13. This is a high performance, very premium gaming tablet. It has 16 cores, 32 threads, and you can get it equipped with 32 gigs, 64 gigs, or 128 gigs of memory. And it has one M.2 slot. That is a short one. So that's one of the biggest cons. All right, now in this final summary review, we're gonna go over everything that we tested in our 4-hour live stream that is linked down below. So if you wanna check all that details out about each game we tested almost all of the games on multiple settings levels, on low, medium, high. Some of the games only had 10 FPS when you run it with everything ultra with ray tracing enabled, not good enough performance. But when you just turn off ray tracing, you pretty much had playable FPS in ultra settings in the vast majority of games with balanced upscaling at QHD resolution. So very playable. The games still look very good. And the thing is, this thing is so portable and so light. It's an extremely impressive portable performance package, both from gaming and a productivity standpoint. All right, so the biggest pros and cons here, obviously, a tremendous amount of performance in a portable form factor, weighs 2.6 pounds by the tablet by itself. I think we weighed it in a little bit more than that, but that's rated by Asus, of course. With the power adapter and the keyboard dock put together, which is detachable. This keyboard dock is detachable, has backlight on the keyboard itself, and the backlight is pretty good, could be brighter, but it's a single zone RGB backlight. The keyboard feels good, but there's a decent amount of wobble to it. The touch screen works fine. It does have a stylus. I was not able to test out the stylus. The touchpad on the keyboard dock itself is also very effective and works quite well. The port selection on this device, we have one USB-A, a headset 3.5 millimeter jack. This button is like a command button over here. It'll pull up a menu that lets you quick switch your fan profiles, open Armory Crate, and open a keyboard for the touch screen if you need to type something in and you don't have the keyboard attached. You can also hold it for a long press to pull up Copilot Plus if you want to interact with the Windows AI agent. You also have a volume rocker and a power button on the right side at the top. On the front, we have a 5 megapixel IR Windows Hello camera that looked pretty good. On the back, we have a 13 megapixel camera that looked really good. Very similar to a smartphone camera quality for taking photos and videos. Probably not quite as good as the latest iPhones and Samsungs and all that, but it's still extremely impressive for a multimedia device, because usually the cameras suck. So very impressive camera quality. Now on the left side, we do have two USB 4s Type-C and HDMI 2.1 are reversible Asus power plug that comes in from a 200 watt power adapter that has a rather short power cable, only about 7 feet or so for the total length, which is shorter than I would like. Then we have a micro SD card slot here. The kickstand has a wide range of motion, so I can show you this. You can lay this thing almost completely flat. Not quite, well, you can obviously lay it completely flat if you want, just like that. But if you wanted to have some angular control or whatever, you can really set it to whatever you want. And it's very stiff here. So very firm support for the tablet itself to stay upright. Now, if you want to upgrade the storage on here, this is where the M.2 storage is. I wish there was 2 of these small ones, or at least one big full-size one so you can get up to 8 terabytes of storage. Of course, you can use the micro SD card slot as kind of an extra storage slot as well. You can put up to 2 terabyte micro SD card in there, but know that the performance and speeds will not be comparable to an SSD and more likely to fail than an SSD over the long haul. You can play some games on it, but again, performance will not be as good. As far as bloatware on here, there's not much. You got McAfee, and I had to uninstall that, but for the most part, that was the only thing that I removed on the system. The My Asus and Armory Crate are the two main applications. You also have AMD Adrenalin, which is a third application you can use to control the laptop. Pretty much everything you need to control the laptop, though, is in Armory Crate on a day-to-day basis. You've got 4 power modes in there: silent, performance, turbo, and manual. And all of them are going to provide basic enough performance, even in games, for the majority of games. But if you really want to reach peak performance, you're going to want to either use turbo or manual mode. Turbo mode really balances the fan noise with performance better. But if you want the peak possible performance in games, pull it 82 watts consistently, then you really need to use manual mode with a higher fan noise, ideally, if you want to peak, reach peak performance. That's the reality. If you want the better balance of performance and noise, then run turbo or performance mode, but just know you'll probably want to set settings down just a little bit more to get more FPS in demanding games. Now, the keyboard and mouse on this feel good to me in terms of actual day-to-day usability, but there's a lot more flex and wobble when you're putting a lot of weight on the keyboard itself. That's the main thing to keep in mind. The key spacing, the keycap size, and the touchpad have all been improved in this 2025 version compared to previous versions. There was a bit smaller, a bit more cramped in the last gen version. The display nits brightness we tested was, I believe, around 480 or so nits. Brightness, I can't remember the exact number, but it was a little bit less than the 500 nits Asus quoted. We also had lower color gamut on the P3 color gamut. We had about 95% of the P3 color gamut compared to the 100% color gamut claimed by Asus. Laptop software itself, the Armory Crate software and My Asus software worked flawlessly in my experience, had no issues. One very unique performance feature for this laptop that you control in Armory Crate or the AMD Adrenalin software is VRAM, or your video memory, on this laptop is unified with the system memory, meaning you can choose how much video memory you use on the system. So you can set it to 8 gigs or 16 gigs, depending on what game or application you are playing, and that can directly impact the game's performance. And so that's the main reason why I recommend, if you're going to buy this laptop, don't buy the 32 gig version, because in this version that I have here, it's not quite enough. If you go 8 and 24 gig split, so 8 gigs of VRAM, 24 gig system memory, that's enough system memory, but it's not enough video memory in more demanding games. So you're going to end up setting textures to medium or low, depending on the game, to not have stuttering and problematic performance. Performance reduction. So for those games, you're going to need to set it to 16 gigs. A little bit extra hassle every time you load into a game to reach peak performance or to not have stuttering occur. Ideally, you could get this with the 64 gig or the 128 gig, and then you can set the video memory to 24 gigs or 32 gigs, and then have 32 gigs of system memory or 32 gigs or 64 gigs or 96 gigs, depending on which one you do and what you set it to be. But obviously, 16 gigs is probably enough for basically all the games at QHD currently. So I would recommend going for the 64 gig model and getting 16 gigs allocated to the video memory. But I love the idea of having unified video and system memory, as long as it's fast enough, because it's going to allow the system to be future-proof from a video memory perspective. You'll never run out of video memory. If you're like, oh, this game requires 32 gigs of video memory, oh my goodness, it's crazy, like in 5 years or something, some crazy game comes out, you can just set it to 32 gigs and you're good to go in the future. So obviously, whether or not you can actually render the game with the GPU in here may be completely different. Now, the Ryzen AI Max 395 CPU comes with 16 cores, 32 threads, which is a ton of CPU performance. And the integrated GPU is the most powerful integrated GPU ever put into a gaming laptop, the Radeon 8060S. And it's tremendous. It's amazing for an integrated GPU. The overall performance in basically every game is possible to get great performance with some tweaking, but know that you will need to tweak some of the settings if you want to have a high FPS gaming experience. This thing is not as powerful as, say, an RTX 4080 or 4090, where you can just slap ultra settings and turn on ray tracing and everything and still get playable frame rates in every title. This one's going to require some finessing and some extra time in the settings to get the game to run smoothly. So you're going to need to fiddle with the settings if you want the best blend of graphics performance and graphics quality, which is usually going to end up somewhere around high graphics with ray tracing disabled in almost all the games I tested. You can use ultra graphics in almost all the games I tested with balanced upscaling at QHD resolution with ray tracing disabled. And if you wanted to enable ray tracing, there's going to be a handful of games that you're going to be able to run ray tracing on low or medium and still get 60 FPS. Just don't expect it, right? In Oblivion, we were running with ray tracing on low because you have to run it on low. That's the only option. Depending on the area, at least 40 FPS, but all the way up to 90 or 120 FPS. So some games you can run with ray tracing. It's just going to really depend on the title. But the majority of games just know ray tracing disabled is pretty much the only setting you have to turn off. And then you can run everything else on high or ultra and get great FPS. All right. So 8 to 64 RAM speed test, we saw super fast speeds, faster than anything I've tested before. So extremely fast RAM speed, though the latency was not as fast as some of the faster RAM that I've tested before. But the latency was still pretty good. CrystalDiskMark was 6,000 read, I believe, and 5,000 something write. So very fast read and write, plenty fast enough for the vast majority of people out there that you're not going to need a faster SSD. But you will probably need a larger SSD because 1 terabyte of storage space really is not very much in 2025. The God of War Ragnarok is 175 gigs, and that's one game. So that's, you can install 5, 6 modern games that are large on this SSD, and then it's full. And when you run out of SSD space in here, and you only have 8 gigs allocated to the VRAM, if you run out of VRAM, it'll crash the system currently. I ran into a lot of crashes because I didn't realize my SSD had reached full capacity. So make sure that your SSD always has maybe 10% left in the SSD at least if you want to ensure that the system does not crash when it runs out of video memory if you have 8 gigs allocated for video memory. So Cinebench R23 and R24, we saw some really good performance for a thin portable system, like insane levels of performance for a thin and portable system. Time Spy, we saw 10,600 in manual mode, 10,300 in turbo mode, 8,000 for performance mode, and around 6,000 for quiet mode. So depending on what you set, it'll increase the power limit up from about 40 to 50 to 65 up to 70 or 82, I believe, for manual mode. So depending on what power limit you set it at, you can get accordingly increased level of performance and fan noise to go along with it. So it's all very expected and normal and follows a nice curve to it. Now, compared to the Asus's marketing claims for Cinebench and Time Spy score, we were a little bit lower than their claimed Cinebench score in particular by about 10% or so. But it was still within range of Silicon Lottery levels, which about 10% variance is about as extreme as it gets. I really wish they had claimed a little bit lower levels of Cinebench R23 performance because if I'm getting 2,000 less than what they estimated, that's doesn't look great in my opinion. Now, under CPU only workload, we saw about 66, 67 watts of continuous throughput, and that was the most the system could sustain over the long haul. But that's because the CPU die is actually smaller than the integrated GPU die. So when you run the CPU and GPU at the same time, there's more surface area to dissipate heat, so you can actually ramp the CPU up to a more sustained 82 watts when the integrated GPU and the CPU are running at the same time, and the temperature remains pretty dang good overall when running games. We were like in the 70s and 80s in the majority of the time when running games. Quickly, let's go over the games. Black Myth Wukong, we were running on high settings, no ray tracing, frame generation enabled, and we were hitting over 100 FPS. Turning off frame generation, we were in the 70s. Very, very responsive, very, very good gameplay. Counter-Strike 2, very high settings. We're doing like 110 to 120-ish FPS. Turning settings to medium and FSR on quality, we were running, I think, around 180, but give or take, it went down to 150, then it went over 200. So bouncing around close to the 180 hertz refresh rate of this QHD display. So very, very good gameplay in Counter-Strike 2. You could even set it to lower settings and get even higher FPS if you want. Cyberpunk 2077 on ultra settings, FSR unbalanced, and frame generation enabled, we were doing close to 100 FPS, I believe. 109, I think, in the benchmark technically. But in actual gameplay, it was more like bouncing around the 100 mark, a little up and below that. If you go to low settings, you can go like 180 FPS in Cyberpunk. If you go to, if you want to increase the settings even higher, maybe turn on ray tracing on low, something like that, you could still get some playable frame rate in Cyberpunk, but don't expect ray tracing on ultra to run that well, okay? It's just not, this is not gonna run ray tracing that well in a lot of games. Elder Scrolls Oblivion, ultra settings, textures on low, depending on the area, you're gonna get like 50 FPS in really, really demanding areas, and then all the way up to 120 FPS in the easier to run areas. And keep in mind, we had VRAM limitations. I only had the VRAM set to 8 gigs in the testing here today, but if we switched it to 16 gigs and 16 gigs for the system RAM, Oblivion would let us run on ultra textures, no problem without any stuttering. This machine really depends on getting the right VRAM set. The problem is Oblivion also wants more than 16 gigs of system memory. So again, that's why I would recommend picking up the 64 gig model of this unit if you're going to buy it, because it lets you run enough system memory and enough VRAM at the same time in all of the different titles. In Hogwarts, on ultra settings with no ray tracing, FSR unbalanced, and frame generation turned on, we were getting like 70, 80 FPS, but the 1% low was not quite good enough. So gonna have to go a little bit lower than ultra, I think, to get ideal frame rates. So on medium, I think we were getting closer to 90 to 100 with frame gen, which is much better. So again, depending on the settings, you can get super high FPS, closer to the 90/100 in almost all of the modern titles. Marvel Rivals, we were doing 140, I think, for a lot of the gameplay there, but it did go up and down a little bit depending on where we were looking and who we were fighting, but it was extremely responsive and played really, really well. Monster Hunter Wilds on low settings with FSR on balance, I believe we're doing 100 FPS, no ray tracing. Turning everything to ultra with no ray tracing got us closer to 60 FPS, which with frame generation, that's not quite good enough. So gonna have to find some kind of middle ground there. Monster Hunter Wilds, of course, being one of those games that's not very optimized, so expect to have a difficult time running that game in particular on the higher level of settings. You're probably going to want to play on the low to medium and with no ray tracing in that game. Witcher 3, able to run about 70 FPS on ultra settings. Again, no ray tracing. If you turn off, if you set things to low, we are doing closer to 90 to 100 FPS. So, and I think in Witcher 3, you really want to go for more FPS. So going to the low to medium settings, I think is a good idea to maximize the fluidity of the gameplay. So overall, in basically all the titles, we were able to achieve very playable, smooth frame rates, but with significant tweaking to the gameplay settings. So going into the Flow Z13 purchase, know that you're going to need to be someone who can change the in-game settings. You can't be like a grandma who doesn't know how to change the settings, okay? So that's the most important thing. And the most important setting to turn off is going to be ray tracing. Turn off ray tracing, set upscaling FSR to balanced, and almost all of the games will be playable just with those two changes alone. Of course, setting the other settings to medium or a mixture of medium and high is going to be playable in the vast majority of games and get you close to 60 to 100 FPS in basically everything. Now, for speakers, the speakers on this unit are sideways facing, so coming out the side here. And I gotta say, when I cupped the speakers like this, the speakers got dramatically louder, like 10 decibels louder. it sounded much better as well. So if you are going to use this to listen to dedicated audio, it'd be smart to put something to the sides of this laptop to bounce the sound back towards the user. Or when you hold it, say you're watching a movie, you probably want to hold it cupped with your hands like this to have the sound, bounce through your hands and back towards the person using the device, because it's a huge difference in terms of audio quality, as well as clarity, and total volume went up massively. But it still wasn't a great speaker sound. Without cupping the audio, I would say it was only like a 7.8 in terms of audio quality. There's not that much bass, and the clarity is not that good. When I was cupping the audio, the volume was significantly improved. It made it easier to understand and enjoy the audio tremendously, but the clarity still was not great. I'd say with cupping, we're probably looking at like an 8.3 for audio quality. It's definitely a lot better, but 7.8 without cupping, 8.3 with cupping, still room for improvement, especially when you compare this tablet versus the premium entertainment audio that you get with something like the iPad Pro, for example, which is just excellent audio in a tablet form factor. So, that's what this is competing against, at least in some ways, for watching movies and whatnot, So it's something to keep in mind, that the audio quality is not going to be quite as good. Overall, can I recommend the Flow Z13? If you are a person who wants a high-performance CPU and who wants to game, and you understand that you need to change a lot of the settings off of Ultra and you'll have to turn off ray tracing, and you're willing to accept those trade-offs, then I think this is a fantastic gaming tablet that provides a ton of CPU performance in an extremely portable form factor, an unbelievably small and portable form factor, quite frankly, for how much performance is in here. So yeah, I can absolutely recommend this. The other thing that's a big downside to this is just the price. This thing starts at $2,300 for the 32 gig model, goes up to $2,600, I believe, for the 64 gig model, and $2,800 for the 128 gig model, something like that. So knowing that the price is an expensive, especially for the amount of GPU performance you're getting, because you could theoretically get the same level of GPU performance with like an $1,100 or $1,200 gaming laptop. That's a pretty significant trade-off, getting the tablet form factor, getting the detachable keyboard, getting the 16 core 32 threads is probably the biggest upside to buying this, say, versus something like the G14. I think a lot of people who are looking for a portable level of performance on this level is probably going to consider the Zephyrus G14 or this, or maybe another tablet if they really value the tablet form factor. When you're talking about overall performance, the biggest upside of this versus the G14, you're looking at that 16 core 32 thread processor just crushing the CPU in the G14. But from a gaming perspective, the gaming performance on the Nvidia GPU with the RTX 5080, for example, is going to blow this out of the water, especially for ray trace based gameplay. If you want to be able to turn on ray tracing and everything, then the G14 is going to have a big leg up over this for raw gaming performance. Plus, the G14 is going to have an OLED display. So that's the other probably biggest trade-off. If you're looking for CPU performance and enough gaming chops in a tablet portable form factor with a good keyboard and a decent selection of ports for a tablet, I think the Flow Z13 is one I can definitely recommend if money is no object, for sure. Those are kind of my thoughts on the Flow Z13. It's such an interesting tablet, and I do plan on actually using this as my secondary computing device going forward, because I think it's awesome for watching content, for playing games on the go, for something I can just grab and throw in my backpack that's a lot smaller than my Blade 18. I'm going to use it, at least for the foreseeable future here, until I maybe change my Blade 18 into a smaller form factor 16-inch laptop, like the Zephyrus G16. Perhaps that might be something I'm looking to potentially switch my Blade 18 into. Or maybe I'll end up keeping this if I end up switching to another 18-inch device for my main laptop. We'll have to just see, because I do like having everything in one. And this definitely has enough power to keep everything in one device. The main downside for me is the smaller storage amount, being only one M.2 and being only the little short SSD size. It's just not enough space for me, only being able to go up to 2 terabytes of storage space. So those are my thoughts on the Flow Z13. Fantastic CPU, great display, enough performance to play the vast majority of games as long as you're willing to fiddle with the settings. I hope you enjoyed this review today and all the benchmarks. Again, full live stream is linked in the video description down below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Brandon out.